Hey guys, key concept 3.1 is going to focus on the Industrial Revolution and its spread from Great Britain to the continent. The first part of this key concept focuses on the fact that Britain established its industrial dominance through mechanization and transportation. And one of the most important questions that we have to answer is why Great Britain? Why not other areas of Europe? And probably the two most important reasons would be the fact that Britain had natural resources, abundant coal, iron ore, and other such materials, as well as its geography. As an island nation, it was protected through natural borders. It had a good system of roads and canals that already existed. And as a result, Britain was able to lead the way at the end of the 18th century for industrial Europe. Another pretty important reason will be the fact that British economic institutions, such as advanced banking, further helped them to develop economically. Going back to the age of exploration, joint stock companies have been formed in Britain, and the laws of primogeniture ensured that a good middle class existed that had a good business acumen and were willing to serve as entrepreneurs and capitalists. And British industrialization was largely through private initiatives, something that's going to differ later on when France and Prussia begin their industrialization on the continent. There are many inventors who also helped lead the way, and many of the inventions were limited to Britain. They were kept within the country and not allowed to be brought to the continent, which furthered the British growth industrially during this time period. And finally, Britain's parliamentary government was very pro-business. They had a stable parliament, and industrial interests were represented well in parliament, especially in the House of Commons. Following the British example, industrialization took root in continental Europe, but often with more state sponsorship. And so a good example of this would be with the railroads. Railroads in Britain were privately run, privately owned. The first railroad itself was the Rocket, and that was built and it connected Liverpool and Manchester, was the first important railroad. And the railroad boom in Britain meant lower transportation costs, larger markets, and cheaper goods. Railway construction itself became a larger industry. This was different in the continent because in the continent, the countries often sponsored the growth of railroads. And so, like we'll see in France, the Industrial Revolution was more gradual than in Britain. There was more government support than there was in Britain for industries. And often, in France, there was more smaller factories than some of the large, massive, and personal factories that did develop in Britain later on. Prussian industrialization also came with more government support. And the Prussian industrialization actually led to Prussia's leadership during the German unification. One example of this would be the growth of the Zollverein. The Zollverein was formed in the 1830s, and Prussia connected the other German states that existed into an economic union. Austria was excluded, and as a result, we're going to see the North German states unify their railroad systems, their system of weights and measurements, and ultimately will make it easier for German unification to occur under Prussian leadership during the second half of the 19th century. As far as Eastern and Southern Europe, they often remained behind. They did not industrialize as quickly, and there was really a combination of factors: lack of resources, geography, the dominance. To keep in mind there was still serfdom in Austria and Eastern Prussia until 1848. There was serfdom in Russia until 1861. And probably most importantly, Britain had experienced the agricultural revolution, as did much of Western Europe. Eastern Europe did not. And, the basically, lack of adequate transportation, lack of adequate materials is going to keep these countries from advancing as much as the Western countries. Finally, during the Second Industrial Revolution, more areas of Europe experienced industrial activity and industrial processes increased in scale and complexity. For example, mechanization of the factory system became the predominant mode of production. And during the first industrial revolution, these modes began with the textile industry and factories, were initiated. But by the second industrial revolution, it was predominantly the way it was, especially in Britain and Germany, the two most advanced countries in Europe economically. There are also new technologies. Examples include not just mass production, but the Bessemer process, the use of electricity, that are also going to further industrialization during this time period, and improved communications such as the telegraph, the telephone, and even the radio by the outbreak of World War I are going to result, in more fully integrated national economies, higher levels of urbanization, and an economic network. Also contributing to this would be the improved transportation, not just the railroads, but steamships, streetcars, airplanes, and by far, of course, the most important being the railroads, which are going to result, as I said earlier, in this, the fact that they're going to see the development of these national economies, of urbanization, and of a global economic network. One final thing to also remember, or factor to remember during the second industrial revolution, was that economic practices often included monopolies. Think about the United States during the Gilded Age and go back to like Rockefeller and Carnegie. This also existed in Europe. There was also banking regulations, which protected bankers. And except for Great Britain, most of the continental countries encouraged protective tariffs in order to build their economy. The British, because of their early lead, made the cheapest products, and therefore they often discouraged protective tariffs. And at one point, Napoleon III sought to sign a free trade deal with Britain. There was too much objection from within his own country to do this. And so we are going to see the continental countries enacting these protective tariffs in order to build up their industries. And by 1914, historians are often divided, but for certain, Germany and Great Britain were the two most powerful industrial countries within Europe. The United States is also one of the leading contenders during this time, and Japan and France were rising industrial powers as well. This was a nice short review. Our next one will be on everyday life.